Hello and welcome to Recovering Community, a podcast about community, what it means, how it's formed and how it can be rebuilt. I'm Les Back and I'm Head of Sociology at the University of Glasgow, and this podcast is all about what it means to think about doing research with communities on the public issues that affect them most deeply in their homes. In this edition of the podcast, we want to ask what it does to a person, or indeed a whole community, when the sanctuary of home is lost. To be homeless is more than not having a roof over your head. It's also about a denial of being, a person out of place, to be looked away from, to ignore, and to not make eye contact with them as you pass busily through Glasgow's central station. The number of people living precariously in the city is increasing. A recent article in the Glasgow Herald says they have doubled recently. This is a story of a deep crisis, not only in housing, but it also reveals the symbiotic relationship between social inequalities, homelessness, violence, and the drug economy. And it's a story that many people and organisations are trying to rewrite. One of them is Glasgow City Council, who have been putting up rough sleepers and vulnerable people, or RSVPs, in a number of city centre hotels for a few years now. For an overstretched local authority struggling to meet demand, this has been a controversial and troubled solution to a very complicated issue. There are some public commentators who love to stir up hatred towards people who they see as living a luxury benefit lifestyle in tax-funded hotels. But the truth is, people housed in these places are without specialist support and left to go it alone, vulnerable to violence and substance misuse. Stories of deaths in these hotels are all too easy to find on local news websites. In November 2022, a Freedom of Information request showed that 23 people had died in 3 Glasgow homeless hotels since March 2020. But there are personal tragedies beyond these headlines. Another organisation working in this field is the Simon Community Scotland, a charity providing information, advice, care, support and accommodation to people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. The Simon Community has a wealth of expertise and lived experience within its team of staff and volunteers. One of them is Jim Thomson, who at the time of our interview was the coordinator of We See You, a project run from the Simon Community's Access Hub in the city centre. Jim and the Simon Community partnered with my colleagues Susan Batchelor and Gormley as part of a major research project on repeat violence in Scotland. It's a piece of work that's urgently important and I wanted to understand it deeply. So instead of a day at my desk, I got off the train at Central Station and met up with Susan, a senior lecturer in sociology, and Caitlin, a lecturer in criminology, who are based in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Morning, Caitlin.
Oh, hi.
And Susan.
Good morning, Liz.
How you doing?
Good, we're good, thank you.
Okay, so we're off to the Simon Community.
That's right. Yes, so this is one of the sites where we engaged with stakeholders to talk about the emergent findings of our recent research, which was funded by the Scottish Government, looking at experiences of repeat violence in Scotland.
So you didn't do the research with the community here in Glasgow, but you were in conversation with and in dialogue with people in a way trying out the findings and getting a sense of how those ideas resonated with them. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is one of the communities, one of the organisations that would be most affected by the research. So it was really important for us to bring the research to them and to other organisations like that once we'd finished the report, once we'd finished the research.
Well, I'm looking forward to meeting people involved in the community and learning more about it.
I think there's someone really important for you to meet here at the Simon Community. Let's go inside.
Jim, good to meet you. I'm Les.
Hi Les, pleased to meet you.
So here we are, the Simon Community.
This is the Access Hub. This is where it all happens.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Yeah, it's not what I imagined at all, you know.
Yeah. Well, they've designed it with colours so people feel relaxed and welcome.
It's a very welcoming sort of place.
Oh, it's nice. We've got training rooms, we've got treatment rooms, we've got counselling rooms, we've got a vet room, trusty cause room, so we've also got a shower for if anybody comes in and they need a shower.
You get treated,
stuff
you can
like
get a shower.
Yeah, definitely. The Access Hub just it's a service like the other, where people come and they're welcome. There are no criteria needs to be met to come in through the doors. Everybody's welcome. No matter what condition you're in, people will be looked after and they'll be cared for.
We're looking forward to finding out more, Jim, about the work you do here. So maybe we could go and have a sit down and talk.
Definitely come through here.
Once we were settled with a cup of tea, I asked Jim to tell me more about his work with WeCU.
We're a service, an out-hour service. No, we open the doors at 6 in the evening now, and we open to 9 o'clock. We provide harm reduction along with psychosocial interventions. No, we do group work. We've got a drama group, we've got a walking group. We have a movie day. We're open 7 days a week. The guys who come through the door are predominantly people who use drugs or substances of one sort or other, and mostly homeless men and women who stay in the city centre and hotels.
Could you just tell us a little bit about the sort of story of the growth of homelessness in the city centre, and particularly the way in which the city's been reacting to that, to the emergence of large numbers of homeless people in the city centre?
I'm sure that the numbers that there were over 700 people in homeless accommodation in Glasgow City, so that'll tell you what the issues we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
And those people, they've lost their homes. They've come to the city centre. They're from all over. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And as I say, the majority of folk that I work with have got issues with addiction, substance use, whether it be alcohol or drugs. Along with that comes mental health issues. You know, so people have either left their home or they've not really had a home. You know, people that have come through the care system, people that have for many, many years have had addiction issues. Obviously I'm an addict myself, you know, I'm in recovery for quite a long time now. And I didn't choose to use drugs because I wanted to party or I wanted to do anything other than stop feeling the stuff that I felt. So I can identify with, even today, you know, people will come through the door today and they'll talk to me and I can take myself right back to when I felt like that. And it's no great, you know what I mean, because we've no really got lots to offer these guys. You just need to walk through the streets of Glasgow city centre now and you can see the trauma it's written over some of the guys' faces, you know what I mean? It's easily visible.
Could I just ask you a little bit about, you know, giving people a place to sleep and board? How did we arrive at this point? And I just wanted to ask you about the relationship between the reaction to the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and how we've arrived at this point.
We had loads and loads of rough sleepers. I'm not too sure on the figure, but we had lots of rough sleepers just pre-pandemic. There were loads of people on the streets. You just had to walk through the city centre and you would see them in doorways. Then COVID came about and we had to react to that. Also Glasgow City Council, they sourced, well, the Simon community were the first organisation to do it. They took over the Ibis up in West Regent Street, I'm sure it was. They took people from the streets directly into that, and they ran that quite successfully until they had to, I don't know, whatever happened, the council had sourced other hotels and people were housed in there. But the Simon community, whilst they were doing it, they were staffed there 24/7. So the men and women in it were supported. You know, so they had the intensive outreach support team there and the street team who were going out supporting people from the streets into this hotel. When that closed, the council used other hotels, you know, the Rennie Mackintosh, the Alexander Thomson, the St Enoch's. hotels out with the city centre, the Queen's Park, the Copeland Road Hotel. Like, there are loads and loads of hotels that are being used. But the problem with these hotels is, like, they were just to get people off the street, but the problem with them is they've not got any support staff in them. No. So the people who are staying in them are alone, and they're nothing worse than being alone in yourself when you just want somebody to talk to. When you get the urge to go and reach out for support or anything like that, and nobody's there. Yeah. You know what I mean? No, the feeling isn't very nice.
So the intention to give people a bed, but actually ends up making people more isolated.
Definitely.
What are the consequences of that, Jim? What do you think results from that? This for putting people in hotels without support. Where does that lead?
Well, people will use more drugs for a start, just to cope. And along with using more drugs, people will put themselves at a higher risk of overdose. We're seeing that with the figures for drug-related deaths in these hotels. If they'd been in appropriate accommodation, supported, they would be alive today, whether we like it or not. Not many people's talking about it, but I was one of the guys. When I can't hide away from my values, I can't not be me, because it's just not right.
I really want to come back to the idea of community, because it feels like a lot of what you're trying to do is to build recovery, because our podcast is called Recovering Community, and in a way it takes on another kind of meaning in the story that you're sharing with us about personal recovery, but also, taking back and making again, and maybe we could come back to that. But I just wanted to bring Caitlin and Susan in, and the link between what Jim's describing and violence.
So we've done a project where we went to various places across Scotland, and one of the big themes that emerged was the link between housing and violence within those communities. And also when we spoke to people and asked them to describe the features of their communities, another important link was with the drug economy. That was something that they brought up themselves unprompted. So the kind of guys that Jim works with experience violence from drug dealers in terms of threats and non-payment of drug debts. They sometimes experience violence from one another as they are trying to seek funds for drug use. And they also experience violence from other people in the community who identify them as vulnerable and target them. And that often leads to them having their homes taken over, or they're leaving the community. And then they end up in hostels or hotels in the city centre where they're alone and vulnerable, and maybe have come from other parts of Scotland and don't have connections here. And these are men and women that don't feel that they can access support services. So they really are on their own, and the violence that they experience is every day. And it compounds the trauma and the failures of the state that they've experienced throughout their lives to support them.
Yeah, I think there's also another form of violence going on there where people they're being left to their own devices. They're being left behind by the state. They're living in conditions that are less than ideal. Like, these are very dangerous and sometimes unsanitary conditions. And, not having the support services or the support staff on site, you're left with the lower levels of security and people feeling extremely unsafe in those places where there is the threat of violence, but there also is actual violence happening in those spaces or nearby. Alongside that, there's the threat of eviction at any given point. There's the threat of being moved to another place in the city that you don't know. There's a violence in that, and having to constantly be ready to move everything that you have. There's an unfairness to that we heard from the people we spoke to for many reasons, but often it was often people that were on the receiving end of violence that were being moved. They were told that it was for their protection, and that kind of unfairness followed people around. It was a feature of the relationship or lack of relationship that they had with the people that were putting them into these places.
So often the judgments that are made about people are made individually, aren't they? And people are blamed individually. But what you're describing is a different way of understanding how we arrived at this position. And I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about how to understand You know, the shocking figures that you're telling us, Jim, about the number of people dying in hotels, preventable deaths, as you say. Yeah. But if we try and understand this within a broader scale, beyond individual tragedies or individual responsibility, what would that look like?
I don't understand it at all. I'm a boy who didn't have much education in his life, but I've been screaming for the rooftops for years about the solution to this. We need more accommodation that provides people the tools to deal with their adverse childhood experiences that they went through, or whatever kind of issues they've got, to be honest, and take them through a kind of an apprenticeship for life, learn them how to live, then take them from these facilities and take them in and put them in a house where they've got the tools to start living. But people aren't living. You just need to go out and stand in the foyer there, and you'll see the suffering day in, day out. And then what you're saying, they're put into hotels and they're alone. You know what I mean? No, and for the simplest wee thing, if somebody happens to maybe overdose and gets took up to the hospital, and they get discharged from the hospital in the morning, they're homeless again. Their room's been closed, so then they're getting took for that place where they maybe have not been quite comfortable, and they're put out somewhere on the other side of the city, because we're not dealing with the issue. No, we're warehousing people. As I say, there are over 700 people in homeless accommodation in Glasgow City. People aren't going to just start moving back into with their mum and dad. Relationships aren't going to just rekindle overnight, and men and women are going to go back to the domestic abuse that they fled. You know what I mean? No, things aren't going to just get fixed.
It's like that suffering is being concentrated in these areas, and then there's obviously those kind of unintended consequences of housing people in a really compact space within a city. People, they're being exposed in a way that they're made more vulnerable in those circumstances. So then that kind of drug market and that drug economy is thriving in those spaces, and the violence that comes with that has been mentioned, then that's all there in that space.
Could you just tell us a little bit about how those patterns in the drug economy and also of use are changing in this situation? That thing about warehousing people is such a powerful way of putting your finger on what's going on.
If you're putting hundreds and hundreds of people into a square mile in the city centre, and these people use drugs, along with that, you're going to get people who sell drugs, people who perpetrate violence, people who exploit people, vulnerable people, people who sell sex, people who buy sex. So when you think of the cost for the NHS and most statutory services, that criminal justice, everything, it would be more cost effective just putting facilities in place that can kind of support people. Just imagine, like 5 of these hotels over the past 5 years, just 5 hotels have made £25 million on housing benefit. So you think if they put that money into building treatment centres and putting staff in place to experienced staff to deal with the people that they're housing, it's a no-brainer really, isn't it?
To support that apprenticeship in life, what you talked about.
And that's it.
Susan, could I just ask you about the discussion about understand what we're thinking about together?
One of the advantages of the approach that we took to doing the study was basing it in particular communities, and that allowed Caitlin and I to understand the features of those communities and not just focus on the individuals that were experiencing violence. And so some of the structural features included sort of generational poverty, lack of investment in sort of local employment sector, disinvestment of services, both very recently in terms of COVID and the sort of more recent economic crisis, but also longer term, particular concerns about the shutting down of youth centres and community centres, and all this contributing to a sense of the people that lived there, that they didn't matter, that they don't count, and that nobody's coming to help. And in that context where you have a more resistant attitude towards the state because your interactions with them are negative, you understandably sort of develop a culture of self-reliance where people look out for one another and don't go and report victimisation or harm to the police. They try and deal with it themselves. So we were looking at some of those structural features of the community as well as some of the cultural features. And within that, masculinity was a particular issue that was important in relation to violence. So both in terms of that sense of sorting things out yourself, being able to stand up for yourself. But those structural features are important to understand in terms of life course as well as community. And so the people that we spoke to that experienced repeat violence, experienced violence growing up in the family home, sometimes very, very serious violence and abuse within the family, violence, abuse within the community. And when the state has attempted to respond to that, for example, through the education, whether that's mainstream education or special educational provision, it's failed. It's failed people. And it's often in those institutional contexts where people experience further violence and develop violent coping mechanisms and also turn to drug and alcohol use to deal with the trauma that they've experienced and the violence that's ongoing. And that isn't dealt with by the system. And so many of the people that we interviewed have a sort of a pattern where that violence starts in the home. They're excluded from school, mainstream educational provision. They perhaps go into the looked after sector, young offenders institutes and prisons, which are very violent places, and they teach this culture of standing up for yourself, not taking any disrespect, and also are often the places where people are introduced to drugs as a means of coping. So in terms of your previous question about individual and wider factors, this is not about individual people making lifestyle choices. It's about a failure of state systems to adequately support the people that are most vulnerable within our society, and people that are often not seen as deserving of support and therefore don't see themselves as deserving, and feel that there is no safe space. There's no safe space at home, in the community. And that's why places like the Access Hub are really important, because it's one of the few safe spaces that are available for people to come to.
So the violence has structural features and it has everyday cultural dimensions as well, but we can't really make sense of it in individual terms at all.
I believe that it's important to understand it in the sense of somebody's individual life story, but you need to understand the context in which that life story plays out, and that's not about the decisions or the experiences that one individual, and there are social patterns. So, it's people from particular communities in Scotland that end up in the criminal justice system and end up homeless, and those are the communities that we see the highest levels of disinvestment.
The experiences that people are having around violence, and especially around repeat violence, they're not isolated incidents. They're interrelated all through the life course, and it follows people around in their lives. But quite often, the people that are experiencing the most repeat violence are the ones that are the least likely to report it. They're the least likely to seek support or feel that support is there for them. Also, that the violence is not the biggest issue that they're dealing with at that moment. It's the threat of losing your house or being homeless or moving to another city or another part of a city that you're unfamiliar with, and all of the fear that comes with that. It's that kind of unsettled nature that comes with that territory. There are the consequences, the direct consequences of experiencing different forms of violence that people have told us about, but there's also the kind of indirect effects that people talked about as well, and that's the fear that people have walking down the street, the fear that something is going to happen to them, and living in that condition is exhausting, it's stressful, and it's there all the time for people, and they're constantly just ready for something like that to happen again. And that was something that came up a lot, that it was there all the time, it was part of their life.
That was often described to us in terms of a sort of sense of hyper alertness, or always being on, sort of wing mirrors on, and if you have an experience of being victimised in that way, you're anxious all the time. And a way to deal with that anxiety is to take substances. So that's another example of that intimate relationship between experiences of violence and engaging in substance use as a means of coping with that.
No, I remember I was in the last homeless accommodation I was in was the Belgrove Hotel. The room it was smaller than a prison cell. The toilets were outside, the showers were outside, and I really went into McDonald's and closed the door and get cleaned because I was too anxious to go into these places and shower.
Listening to you, Jim, it makes me think, recovery needs community in a way. That's partly what all of the things that you're doing and are developing seem to be in the service of.
It's what we need, but it's very, very difficult to do it in this environment. So you've got guys for a few hours and you can do so much with them, but then you're sending them back out to these environments. You're sending them back to the hotel room where they're going to be alone. So it's difficult. So the first thing in the morning when you do get up and you go out and somebody offers you a handful of drugs and a handful of pills, you take them. So when you've got getting you later on in the day, you're not really in a condition to kind of take part in life. And that's what the guys they're crying out today. But so many people are trying to take away their pain, and the only way to do that is by using more drugs. We've not really got the capacity to work miracles, you know what I mean? And sometimes that's what we need.
Just the work that Jim is doing with the WCU group really takes forward the recommendations from the research, and those are that you can't prevent violence by a criminal justice response, that you need a sort of a multi-sectoral approach that looks at people where they are in their lives and brings different services together. And as Jim says, the Access Hub is able to do some of that, but the lack of funding is really the issue that he's struggling with the WCU group. But what he is addressing is something that a lot of our participants said was important, was engaging with grassroots communities that are staffed by people with lived experience that they can relate to, but that also have the skills and the experience to be able to deal with violence when it may be an issue, so that people can relate to. But also people like Jim that have lived experience are really important role models for people that are wanting to start the recovery journey, because they can see a positive destination. So that's also really, really important for them. So off their own initiative, the WCU group are sort of trying to adopt that model and, do something themselves, but they can't do it on their own. They need to be supported by a wider range of services.
So we really need to sort of foster communities of recovery, really.
Absolutely. And that is something that, it's not Caitlin and I's idea. That, that is what participants told us time and time again. And the value of a recovery community, of having people that will just sit there with you on the journey, that have that experience, that don't judge you, is absolutely important. And there are different types of community, but that sort of shared experience, but also a shared destination, is really important.
It's very difficult to get people into any kind of treatment centre or detox centre where they get to a place where they feel as if, right, I'm ready to go and live. You know what I mean? Well, I'm ready to deal with these feelings that I'm feeling without having to use drugs. No one put my life at risk, because the way people feel, they're willing to risk their life so they don't feel it. The risk of death is better than the risk of living. Do you know that?
Jim, in a way, your story has been about losing a sense of community or having to leave a community, but it feels like what you're doing here is building a community.
Well, I'm trying. For years and years and years, I did isolate in my own community. I ostracised myself from them. I didn't want to take part in it because I used drugs, because I didn't feel worthy. I'd failed not only my family, my children, I'd failed everybody. I'd failed myself most of all. So I left the community behind, and that's why, when I went into homeless accommodation, I didn't feel, to be honest, anything, because I just took drugs to stop feeling. Then my mother died. When my mother died, the drugs stopped working. I felt a pain that drugs wouldn't take away. So there were only two things that I could do. I could either die or get well. So I went in and I managed to get into the drug crisis centre. And that's when I made the decision not to take drugs anymore. No, like for me, and as much as my life was quite messed up, I had to learn how to live again. I had to learn how to pay bills. I had to learn how to clean. I had to learn how to shower. I had to learn how to do washings. I had to learn how to do everything. And I had to get took away from society to do it. No, I went to rehab. I was in a treatment centre for 6 months. And when I came out of the rehabilitation centre, I started volunteering with the Simon community. And I found a purpose. I found a purpose because I seen people with nothing. No sense of belonging, like they were coming to us for clean socks or a cup of tea, just to feel as somebody was there. But when we got the BCU project, it was like a dream come true. It really was, because I thought, no, we'll be able to build that community. But to go beyond that, to have a facility, a standalone service that's not just like for 3 hours a night, I believe if we had that with the proper staff, with my staff team, we could perform miracles. You know what I mean? Because people don't want to be sick. People are sick of being sick, but they don't know any other way.
Making home is not only about a physical everyday inhabitation. It involves a reckoning with the world as it is, but also how we would like it to be. It's an existential experience. To be denied access to a home is also to be denied a capacity to learn how to live, or as Jim says, an apprenticeship in life itself. The writer and critic John Berger described this as a place from which the world could be founded. Where am I? Where do I belong? And who do I want to be? These questions are being asked on every street corner, in every community, every day. Thank you for listening to this episode of Recovering Community. I'm Les Back, and I wanted to say a huge thank you to Jim Thomson, Susan Batchelor and Caitlin Gormley for such an insightful and generous conversation. You can find out more about Susan and Caitlin's report on repeat violence in Scotland and the work of the Simon Community Scotland online, and I'll leave a link in the show notes. I really hope you're enjoying this series of Recovering Community. It makes a huge difference if you subscribe and share. For our last episode of this season, I'm in Sheffield, asking how communities think about heritage in relation to their city.
The funny thing, when I was in Kenya, my dad used to always tell me, you see these spoons? They're from England. You see these forks from England, and they're durable and they're nice and they're very good stuff. It's like he was introducing me to Sheffield unconsciously. And when I came here, it's like, wow, this is the city my dad was talking about.
Thanks to the staff in the School of Social and Political Sciences and the College of Social Sciences who helped with this project. Recovering Community is produced by Freya Hellier.